Okay, so this is chapter 3, part 2. I'm just going to kind of follow on to the example I just had, which was the burning of ethanol. So the first thing I want to do then is let's go back, and now that you know what ethanol looks like, I'm going to erase that at the moment. I'll redraw it in a second. But I want to get our chemical equation written properly. Because if you remember when we did methane, and I'm going to redraw methane real quick here just so you remember. When we did methane, it was CH4 and oxygen yielding CO2 and water. But the first thing to determine was, once we knew that this was how what the reaction required in terms of reactants and what it produced in terms of products, we had to figure out, well, is this balanced? Do we have the right numbers here? And again, at the molecular level, the methane a methane molecule could require 1, 2, 3, 4, any number of oxygen models to burn, oxygen molecules to burn. Or similarly, a single oxygen molecule could end up burning multiple methane molecules. But it's always whole number ratios. There's always a certain number that are in, integer numbers. So when we went through this, I think when I drew this, I drew that in order for the two waters would grab an oxygen, and these other, the two hydrogens would grab an oxygen. The other two hydrogens would grab an oxygen, and the carbon needs two more oxygens, so that's why we needed a second one. And then this guy would go off with these guys and form one of these, and we'd end up making two of these. So it required two oxygens, and it produced two waters, and only one methane and one carbon dioxide, which of course, if you remember, like in algebra, you don't have to have one is kind of implied. Okay, but truly it means one methane combines with two oxygen molecules at a molecular level to produce one carbon dioxide molecule and two water molecules. Okay, now this is one thing I want to point out that's kind of key. This is, and again, think like algebra, this is in its fully reduced form. But there's no reason why, just like in algebra, you couldn't take this entire equation and multiply by 10. Okay? In which case you'd end up with 10 methane molecules and 20 oxygen molecules would combine to create 10 carbon dioxide molecules and 20 water molecules. All I did was multiply 10 by times each factor here, again, just like you do in algebra, and we get this, which is completely 100% identical. It's just not in a fully reduced form. And if you think about this logically, this makes sense. Is that if you had 10 methane molecules, we know from our original equation that it's a 2-to-1 ratio. It takes twice the number of oxygen molecules as it is methane to burn it. So 10 and 20 is fine. For that matter, it could be 100 and 200. That's fine too, right? In fact, it could be a zillion, I don't want to say a zillion, a million methanes and 2 million oxygens produces a million carbon dioxides and 2 million waters. You can put anything you want in there from a number standpoint. Okay, this is essentially, the reason I'm pointing all this out is for two reasons. One, we need to be able to make use of this in some of our chemical reaction problems that we're going to encounter. But secondly, this highlights the fact why the mole idea is legitimate. Because what the mole idea says is that if we had 1 mole of methane molecules, if you remember that was a really big number, and 2 moles of oxygen molecules, how many moles of carbon dioxide would it make? Well, it would make 1 mole of carbon dioxide and 2 moles of water. Now what that means numerically is it basically means I'm just going to abbreviate this, 6 times 10 to the 23rd methane when combined with 12 times 10 to the 23rd oxygen. These are in terms of number of molecules, is going to produce 6 times 10 to the 23rd carbon dioxide molecules and 12 times 10 to the 23rd water molecules. It's an arbitrary number. It's a big number, just like we were using 100 or 200 or a million or whatever. But the mole actually has some other value that you'll get at. But this is completely legitimate. When we take any equation like this, we can imagine the only thing that's important are the ratios, the numeric ratios between the reactants and the ratios between the reactants and the products. Okay, maybe I've beaten that one to death, but this is essentially really the whole concept of mole, and why it's okay, and actually why it's really conceptually the same as thinking about these reactions happening at a molecular level. Okay. Now I want to show you why this is useful. Hope I can get this one in. Actually, I'm not going to talk about ethanol. Well, maybe I want to. So let me get ethanol in there because I've got it in there for another reason. Okay. All right. As I showed you before, ethanol is essentially 2 hydrogens, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 waters. Hydrogens. Sorry, 2 carbons. Let me start again. 2 carbons, 6 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. It's going to mix with some amount of O2, and it's going to produce some amount of CO2 and some amount of water. Okay. All right. Now, let's try to figure out what coefficients we need to actually include on the various parts. Now, here's kind of the trick. The trick goes: start with, on the left side, start with whatever the reactant is that has the largest number of one of the elements. So I'm going to focus on ethanol here. It has 2 carbons, if you see that, right? So immediately we can tell, since the right only has carbon in one of the products, obviously we're going to need a 2 here. Okay. So if we put a 2 here, then the carbons will at least be balanced on the left versus the right. Okay. Now, if you look at it also, you can say, yeah, well, but what about oxygens? Well, oxygens is tricky because oxygen is in 2 different products, and it's actually in 2 different reactants as well. So let's not look at that. Let's look at hydrogen instead. Hydrogen, we have 6 hydrogens on the left, and we only have one of the products that has hydrogen in it, which is water. So how many hydrogens do we need to make up the 6 hydrogens? Well, that's easy. It's 3. Okay. 3 waters, and again, there's 2 hydrogens in each water, so 3 waters has 6 hydrogen atoms. So that the H is now balanced as well. The only thing that's left here to worry about now is the oxygens. Well, how many oxygens do we have? On the right-hand side, we have 3 plus 4. We have 7 oxygens, and here we have 1 and we have some unknown here. So what do we need to have that have the left? What kind of coefficient in front of the oxygen do we need to end up with 7 oxygens on the left? Again, there was 7 on the right, and we need 7 on the left. Well, it's 1 plus 2 times x equals 7. Just an algebra problem, and you can solve, and x equals 3. So again, to study that, we say, do all of the atoms balance here in this chemical reaction? Well, the carbons do. There's 2 on each side. The hydrogens do. There's 6 here and there's 6 here. And the oxygens do. There's 7 on the left and there's 7 on the right. So voila, that's burning ethanol. So it's 1 ethanol plus 3 oxygens yields 2 carbon dioxides and 3 waters. There's our reaction for methanol. It could be one of the problems, which is derive the formula, the chemical reaction for burning ethanol. Okay. All right. I'm going to use this in the next video to actually answer a question that involves moles. And by the way, the one thing I want to mention here is that I said 1 ethanol molecule plus 3 oxygen molecules will yield this. But I could have easily also said 1 mole of, or 1,000 of, or some other number like that. But 1 mole of ethanol plus 3 moles of oxygen would actually produce 2 moles of carbon dioxide and 3 moles of water. Okay. We're going to use that in the next video to actually solve some of these questions of, well, how much does this produce, or how much is needed, that kind of thing. We'll get into that as we into the next video. One thing I want to point out, though, is kind of sort of philosophical in a way, is think of this reaction as basically taking ethanol, breaking ethanol down into its lowest form components. Well, this is what happens when you drink alcohol. If you drink alcohol, drink beer or something like that, you're taking alcohol in your system, and the oxygen that you breathe gets into your bloodstream, and eventually in your digestive system or in your bloodstream, you end up metabolizing, meaning reacting ethanol with oxygen and producing these byproducts. And of course, one thing I didn't say, but I said earlier, it does produce quite a bit of heat when you burn this in a lab. And I told you earlier, it burns hot. So why is it that when you burn ethanol in your bodies, it doesn't burn a hole in you? Why is that? That's something we'll talk about. So that's all. I want to end the video there. And then next, I'm going to pick up with solving problems involving moles in chemical reactions.